Imagine one of the richest, most sophisticated nations on Earth deciding on purpose to lock its own doors. Not for a year, not for a decade, for more than 200 years. Its people were forbidden to leave, on pain of death. Sailors shipwrecked on its coast could be imprisoned or executed. Great ocean-going ships were left to rot or never built at all. And while the rest of the world was busy crossing oceans, trading spices, and racing toward the modern age, this country quietly pulled the shutters closed and turned inward, deliberately and almost completely. That country was Japan, and the strangest part is that it hadn't always been this way. Only a few decades earlier, Japan had been one of the most curious, outward-looking places on the planet, hungry for foreign goods and foreign ideas. So what changed? Why would a nation with everything to gain from the outside world choose to seal itself off from it for over 2 centuries? The answer, it turns out, isn't really about a fear of foreigners at all. It's about something much closer to home. To understand it, we have to go back to the moment the outside world first came knocking. In 1543, a storm blew a Chinese ship carrying a handful of Portuguese merchants onto a small Japanese island called Tanegashima. It was an accident, but it changed everything. These were the first Europeans most Japanese had ever laid eyes on, and they came carrying something Japan had never seen before, the matchlock gun. Within just a few years, Japanese smiths were copying these firearms by the thousand, and the timing could not have been more explosive. Japan at that moment was not a calm, unified country. It was shattered into dozens of warring domains, each ruled by a warlord, a daimyo, locked in a savage, century-long civil war for supremacy. Into that chaos, European guns dropped like a match onto dry grass. Within a generation, entire battles were being decided by massed gunfire, and the warlords who mastered these new weapons began to swallow their rivals whole. But guns were only the beginning. In 1549, a Jesuit missionary named Francis Xavier stepped ashore, and with him came something even more powerful than a weapon, a new idea, Christianity, and what followed surprised nearly everyone. The new faith spread with astonishing speed, especially across the southern island of Kyushu. Ordinary farmers converted, so did powerful lords, some out of genuine belief, and others for a more practical reason. Becoming Christian meant favored access to the rich Portuguese trade and to the silk, silver, and guns that flowed with it. Within 2 generations, by some estimates, there were as many as 300,000 Christians in Japan. There were churches, there were seminaries, there were entire Christian towns, and a Japanese Christian community that European priests hailed as one of the most promising in the whole world. If you find these turning points fascinating, the moments where history could so easily have gone another way, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what this channel exists to explore. For a while, Japan's rulers welcomed all of it. The most powerful warlord of the age, Oda Nobunaga, actively encouraged the Christians, partly out of curiosity and partly because it was useful. The great Buddhist monasteries were among his fiercest political enemies, and a rival religion was a handy way to keep them off balance. But Nobunaga was betrayed and killed by one of his own generals, and the man who eventually clawed his way to the top saw the newcomers very differently. His name was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and he was the first to truly sense danger. Hideyoshi looked at the growing mass of Christian converts and asked a question that would haunt Japan's rulers for the next 50 years. Where does their loyalty actually lie? A Japanese peasant was supposed to obey his lord, and his lord alone. But a convert now also answered to a foreign god, a distant pope, and European priests, men who took their orders from a power on the far side of the world. To a ruler straining to hold a fractured country together, that was not simply faith, it was a rival chain of command, running straight out of his kingdom and into foreign hands. And then Hideyoshi looked south and saw something that frightened him far more. The Spanish had recently conquered the Philippines right on Japan's doorstep, and the pattern there was impossible to ignore. First came the traders and the missionaries, and then, close behind them, came the soldiers and the flag. Christianity, in other words, might not be just a religion. it might be the leading edge of a conquest. In 1587, Hideyoshi issued an order expelling the missionaries. He barely enforced it. The trade was simply too valuable to lose, but a warning shot had been fired. 10 years later, in 1597, he went much further and had 26 Christians, European missionaries, and Japanese converts alike crucified. The mood was turning dark. Then came the man whose family would truly shut the door. In the year 1600, a patient, ruthless warlord named Tokugawa Ieyasu won a colossal battle at Sekigahara and made himself master of all Japan. 3 years later, he took the ancient title of shogun and founded a dynasty that would rule the country for the next 2.5 centuries. And here, we reach the very heart of the story. Because to understand why the Tokugawa sealed Japan off, you have to understand what they feared most of all, and it was not foreigners, it was chaos. The Tokugawa had fought their way to power out of more than 100 years of civil war. Their single overriding obsession was to make sure that war could never return. So they built an entire system designed to freeze Japanese society in place, to lock every person and every lord into a fixed rank from which no one could ever again grow strong enough to threaten the shogun. They even forced the great lords to spend every other year living in the shogun's capital, and to leave their families behind as permanent hostages when they returned home. This was a regime obsessed above all else with control. And when a regime like that looked out at the wider world, it did not see opportunity. It saw threats it could not govern. Think about what foreign trade actually offered an ambitious rival lord. It offered wealth pouring in from Portuguese ships. It offered guns in dangerous quantities, and it offered a foreign religion that could bind his subjects together in a devotion that had nothing to do with the shogun in his distant castle. Picture a daimyo in the far south, rich from trade, armed with European muskets, and backed by a fervent Christian population. That was precisely the kind of independent power the Tokugawa had just spent decades crushing. To them, foreign contact was not a window onto the world. It was a door through which their very worst nightmare could walk right back in. So in 1614, the Tokugawa banned Christianity outright and began to hunt it with real ferocity. Believers were ordered to renounce their faith. Those who refused were tortured and executed. And here, the Europeans helped seal their own fate because they were divided against each other. The newcomers, the Protestant Dutch and English, were bitter rivals of the Catholic Portuguese and Spanish, and they were only too happy to murmur in the shogun's ear that the Catholics genuinely were plotting to conquer Japan from within. The Dutch dangled a tempting offer. "We will trade with you," they said, "and we have no interest whatsoever in converting your people. We want only business." For a ruler who craved the profits of trade, without the peril of the religion attached to it, that was an irresistible bargain. Under the third shogun, Tokugawa Iemitsu, the door swung shut in earnest. In a series of edicts through the 1630s, the shogunate forbade Japanese people from leaving the country and forbade any Japanese already living abroad from ever returning home, on pain of death. Building ships large enough to cross open ocean was outlawed. Foreign trade was squeezed down into a single closely watched port. And then, in 1637, the shogunate's deepest fear seemed to rise up and take physical form. In the Shimabara region, a former Christian stronghold in the south, the local lord had been grinding his peasants down with brutal taxes in the middle of a famine. Pushed past breaking point, tens of thousands of them rose up in open revolt. Many were Christians, and they rallied behind a charismatic teenage leader named Amakusa Shiro, marching under Christian banners. Around 37,000 rebels barricaded themselves inside an old castle beside the sea and held out against everything the shogunate hurled at them. It took an army of more than 100,000 men and cannon fire from a Dutch ship anchored offshore to finally break the walls. When the castle fell, the shogunate's forces killed almost everyone inside. Tens of thousands died. To the Tokugawa, the lesson of Shimabara was written in blood. Christianity did not merely divide loyalties. It could set the whole country ablaze in rebellion against the state. Whatever hesitations still remained now vanished completely. In 1639, the shogunate expelled the Portuguese from Japan for good. The Spanish had already been thrown out years before. To make certain no missionaries could ever slip back in, the government forced every single household to register at a Buddhist temple and made people prove they were not Christian by trampling on images of Christ and the Virgin Mary. The Christians who survived went so deep underground that they would not resurface for over 200 years, a hidden community secretly passing down half-remembered prayers, generation after generation, in total silence. Only one group of Europeans was allowed to stay, the Dutch, precisely because they cared for profit and not for conversion. And even they were not truly welcome. They were confined to a tiny artificial island in Nagasaki Harbor called Dejima, a fan-shaped patch of reclaimed land barely a couple of 100 meters wide. The Dutch traders there lived almost like prisoners, watched at every hour, allowed off the island only rarely and under guard. And yet through that single narrow keyhole, a thin but precious stream of Western knowledge, of medicine, astronomy, and science, would trickle into Japan for the next 2 centuries, studied by a small circle of scholars who called it simply Dutch learning. But here is a detail that often gets lost, and it matters a great deal. Japan's isolation was never total. The very word we now use for this whole policy, sakoku, meaning closed country, was actually invented long afterward. The people living through it did not even call it that. Alongside the Dutch at Nagasaki, Japan went on trading with China. It kept up relations with Korea through the island of Tsushima. It dealt with the Ryukyu kingdom to the south through the Satsuma domain, and with the Ainu people to the north through the Matsumai clan. Historians sometimes call these the 4 gateways. The truth is that Japan did not blindly wall itself off from the entire planet. It did something far more deliberate and far more clever. It seized absolute control over exactly who could enter, who could leave, and what could come in, and it placed that control in the hands of no one but the shogun. This was not the panic of a frightened, backward country. It was a calculated monopoly on the outside world. So, why did Japan close itself off for more than 200 years? Pull the threads together, and 3 reasons rise above the rest. The first was religion, though not as a matter of belief. It was a matter of control. Christianity created a loyalty the shogun simply could not command, and as the fate of the Spanish Philippines warned, it might be only the opening move of a foreign takeover. The second reason, and the deepest, was the Tokugawa obsession with internal stability. Having ended a century of war, they built their entire order on a single principle, that nothing must ever be allowed to shift. And foreign trade, foreign guns, and foreign faith were all forces of change they could not fully control, so they cut them off at the root. And the third reason is the simplest of all. It worked. The isolation delivered more than 200 years of nearly unbroken peace, a stretch of stability almost without equal anywhere in the world. Why would the shogunate ever abandon a policy that had handed it precisely what it wanted? And that raises a genuine question worth arguing over. One I would honestly love to hear your answer to in the comments. Was it worth it? Did Japan buy itself centuries of peace at the price of falling dangerously, perhaps fatally, behind the rest of the world? Tell me where you land on that down below. Because there was a price, and eventually it came due. While Japan stood frozen and peaceful, the outside world did not stand still. It kept moving, through revolutions, through industry, through steam and steel. And in 1853, that world came back in the shape of 4 American warships under Commodore Perry, steaming into a Japanese bay trailing black smoke, carrying cannon that Japan had no hope of matching. The shogunate, which had bolted the door precisely to keep the world out, now discovered it no longer had the strength to keep it shut. Within 15 years, the shogunate itself was gone, swept aside by a nation suddenly desperate to catch up. And catch up it did with such breathtaking speed that within a single lifetime, the country that had once banned ocean-going ships was building a modern navy of its own. That is the strange paradox at the heart of Japan's long isolation. The very policy meant to preserve the shogun's world turned out to be the thing that guaranteed its collapse the instant the door was forced open. And yet those same shuttered centuries had quietly done something else, too. They had allowed a singular culture to blossom in near total seclusion, and they had stored up a deep hunger for the outside world that, once finally released, would help launch Japan into the front rank of global powers. The Tokugawa shut the doors to freeze time. In the end, they did not stop the clock at all. They only wound the spring. If this was worth your time, a like genuinely helps the channel reach more curious people. And if you want more questions like this one answered honestly and in full, subscribe and stick around. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and I'll see you in the next one.